Welcome to the video warm-up for this week's module that examines the cognitive neuroscience aspects of learning. This is where we want to try to wrap our hands around a few key ideas about how learning really takes place in the brain. This warm-up and the related video tutorial are designed to engage you with ideas that are not dealt with in any significant way by Miriam and Birma, but which I feel are important for understanding what brain science tells us that we should know as designers of adult learning experiences. We have essentially three learning objectives for this week. One is to understand the basic aspects of brain function, be able to relate those to learning processes and memory formation. We want to be able to describe conflicting perspectives about the brain and learning, including perhaps your own existing beliefs. And we want to connect instructional strategies, including the ones you're experiencing in this course, to neurological and cognitive understandings of brain function during learning. Now, take a moment to see if you recognize who this is. Your brain is working, taking in this visual cue, going through stored memories for a match. Did you recognize that this was Sting? Assuming that you did, now I may ask, did you know that Sting had a career as a teacher before he was a pop icon musician? Here's what Sting realized as a teacher. It dawned on me about 2 weeks into the first year that it was not teaching that was taking place in the classroom, but learning. Teaching and learning are certainly companion activities, but as teachers it is sometimes too easy to get so wrapped up in what we're doing that we forget that learning is the objective, not the delivery of instruction. And this brings us back to a question that I asked you in week 2. Do you remember being asked to provide a definition of the verb to learn? You offered a variety of possibilities, which you can go back and review in the discussion forum for that week if you desire to. In general, however, you provided definitions similar to this one, which is how cognitive psychologists typically view learning. That is, that learning has occurred when information can be retrieved after a period of disuse and applied to new situations. Although sounding simple, this definition has important implications. In order to retrieve information after a period of disuse, that information has to have been placed in memory, and it has to be organized in memory in a way that it can be found again. Also, in order to apply the information in new situations, there needs to be some sort of deep understanding of information and how to use it, rather than rote memorization. So learning is about forming memories that can be retrieved and used. How does that happen? Here is a different perspective to contemplate. Our memorable quote for this week comes from evolutionary psychologist Henry Plotkin, who appropriately points out that learning is a biological process during which the brain is permanently changed. Which leads to this definition by a university biology professor. Learning is the stabilization through repeated use of certain appropriate and desirable synapses in the brain. Perhaps not a very poetic definition, but actually very true. The learning process connects brain neurons with synapses. Perhaps this generates an image for you similar to this diagram from our previous module on organizing information as a critical aspect of making memories. It is this connection and stabilizing of connections between neurons that represents the changing structure of the brain during learning. This colorized electron microscope image shows neurons, the big blobs, connected by threads, which are the synapses. Now don't let this busy diagram get you too confused and frustrated. There's just a couple of things that we really need to pick out in it. Neurons, like this big spidery thing, are connected to one another by strings of tissue called synapses during the learning process. However, these synaptic connections are not necessarily stable and can easily disintegrate if not myelinated. The growth of a myelin sheath over the synapse increases the likelihood of permanence through both repeated use and, it turns out, adequate sleep. Neural networks connect to one another to generate complex memories, analogous to how we previously considered the importance of organizing and chunking information during learning. Memories represented by these neural networks come in various forms. For instance, procedural memories allow us to carry out ordinary motor actions automatically once we have learned them. They can be recalled to mind, but usually remain unconscious. Such skills are stored in brain areas deep within the brain. Declarative memories, on the other hand, are the things that we have come to consciously think about in order to bring them into our mind. Declarative memories are created and stored primarily in the outer part of the brain, called the cerebral cortex. One type of declarative memory is episodic memory, or the memories of events in our lives. The parts of the brain involved in episodic memories depend on the content of the original experience. Highly visual experiences, for example, will activate visual neural networks in the brain, while remembering a person's voice will activate the auditory part of the cortex. Semantic memories are the facts that you possess. The fact that humans once walked on the moon, for example, is something that likely exists as factual knowledge in the semantic memory of everyone who experiences this video. If you're old enough, as I am, then the memory of the first moonwalk is also part of your personal experience. For someone who has such an episodic memory of the Apollo 11 mission, the details of the semantic knowledge are stronger than for someone who learned about the first moonwalk from a teacher, a documentary, or by reading it in a book. This interaction of episodic memory and semantic memory is important for planning instruction. Passive learning through reading or listening does not generate episodic memories that can help to amplify semantic memory through larger neural networks. However, an effective active learning activity has the potential to develop an episodic memory that enhances that semantic memory. Another important distinction is between the declarative and procedural memories that are stored as long-term memories and the working memory, sometimes called short-term memory, that makes a plan of action while calling up items from the rest of the brain in order to think through an active problem. Of critical importance is the observation that deep learning and retrieval of memories from long-term memory require that the information was originally manipulated in working memory. Although there are a lot of outstanding mysteries about how learning and storage of memories really take place in the brain, there are growing insights from the realm of neuroscience, especially for understanding what parts of the brain are responsible for which processes. For instance, brain imagery can detect the electrical signals that are fired along synapses between neurons, and these images are particularly informative when collected while the subject undertakes various learning tasks. In the illustration in the center of this slide, the subject is looking at possible solutions to a mathematical problem, and the hot spot of activity near the rear of the brain represents the visual input, and the activity that shows up in the front of the brain represents utilization of working memory to solve the problem. The roles of different parts of the brain for different learning functions is also revealed through the observed effects of spatially specific brain injuries and surgeries. Declarative memories, and especially the semantic memories that are targeted for creation by teaching and training, are generated by neural networks in the outer part of the brain called the cerebral cortex. And learning functions are divided among 4 lobes that are named here, although not something necessary for you to keep track of for a long time. Occipital, parietal, frontal, and temporal lobes. The largest and most readily stabilized neural networks are associated with learning activities that activate all 4 of these lobate learning centers. So let's walk through them quickly. Most new learning is triggered by a sensory input, usually sight or sound, and those inputs come in primarily to the occipital lobe, and to a lesser degree parts of the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is also the focus of actions in response to sensory inputs or directions from elsewhere in the brain that may be activated during learning. The sensory information is combined with activity-derived inputs and manipulated in the frontal lobe. This is where thinking and sense-making go on, the hotbed of working memory. Long-term memory resides in the temporal lobe and is where most semantic memory knowledge is stored. The neural networks here are stabilized and enlarged through repeated use, incorporation of new information, and the myelination process that mostly happens during sleep when the brain doesn't have to pay attention to so many other things. We can use the integration of the learning functions in the lobes of the cerebral cortex in order to understand three memory-forming processes. Encoding is the term used for the various processes by which information is transformed into a memory representation called a memory trace. That trace is constructed in a working memory in the frontal lobe, shown here in blue, but the processes are set in motion at the time of the experience of new auditory and visual stimuli coming in from the occipital lobe, and perhaps activity from the parietal lobe, the green slice of the brain, to form a mental representation that records some aspect or aspects of the experience. Consolidation is the organization and stabilization of memory traces concurrent with the transfer of memory from short-term in the frontal lobe to a long-term memory in the temporal lobe, as shown by the yellow arrow, moving from the blue frontal lobe to the yellow temporal lobe. This process gives meaning to the memory traces by connecting them to past experiences and knowledge already stored in the long-term memory. This is where prior knowledge is so important to overall learning, because if there isn't an existing neural network to assimilate the new knowledge, then this new input will likely not be easily stabilized. And then lastly, retrieval is the process of bringing up information from long-term memory. And this happens in the presence of new experiential inputs, shown by the blue arrows. Bringing in those experiential inputs as the long-term memory is brought up into working memory again, which leads to encoding and reconsolidating a memory with new information attached to it, which causes new encoding and reconsolidation of a stronger memory. So let's go back to where we started, the picture of Sting. When I asked you who this was, your occipital lobe processed the visual image and moved it into working memory in the frontal lobe in an effort to answer the question. Your working memory then called up long-term memory in the temporal lobe, the yellow part of this diagram, in order to recognize the singer, if you were successful, that is. Then you heard me tell you that Sting was also a teacher, a new sensory input. Perhaps this was a new piece of information that was brought into working memory and connected with the other information being actively manipulated there as you were paying attention to what you were seeing and hearing. And now, a possibly enlarged memory of Sting that includes his career as a teacher is being moved into your long-term memory, where it may become a reconsolidated memory of Sting while you sleep tonight. The change in factual information represents a semantic memory, which may be enhanced by the episodic memory of remembering your engagement with this question while watching the video. The video tutorial in this week's module takes a still deeper look at how instructional choices by teachers and trainers can maximize the formation of memories. This brief exploration of brain function during learning will hopefully provide a useful perspective as you engage with the somewhat more philosophical ideas within the Miriam and Birma text, and to contrast some of those ideas with the assigned article on neuromyths about learning. So as you go through the rest of the learning resources for this week and think about your 4R assignment, here's some things you can be thinking about. Can you relate your learning experiences, including those in this course, to memory-forming processes? Can you connect the traditional learning theories that we examined last week and other topics that we previously considered in the Ambrose et al. Text to cognitive functions in the brain? And also keep in mind as you're reading and thinking about the videos, what surprised you about neurological research on learning processes? Look forward to seeing how you pursue these ideas in your 4R assignment this week. Adios.